All right, so inheritance is a mechanism where properties are passed down from a parent class to a child class. Said another way, derived classes inherit properties from parent classes. So why do we want to use inheritance? If you remember, one of the things we try to hammer down in this curriculum is how important dry coding is. So utilizing inheritance will reduce the repetition of code and increases code reusability, as well as creating relationships between classes and applying changes to objects consistently and seamlessly. So can anyone tell me, looking at this code, what is wrong with it?
It repeats itself.
It definitely does. Definitely does. How would you say we could avoid this?
You could have a class called employee.
Mm-hmm. And what would be, let's say, special about that class employee?
You can have like something like title, and then the rest of the things repeat themselves, like employee ID, department, something like that.
Exactly, exactly. That's true. And we would be utilizing inheritance and aspects of inheritance to do that, such as this function here called super. What super does is it allows you to take the initialized parameters from the superclass or the parent class. So we no longer have to reinitialize the parameters that have been passed down from the parent class. So we see programmer uses super to take the initialization for name, employee, and department, and all that's left for it to initialize is languages, which are unique to the programmer and do not exist for the basic employee.
So, can I ask a question real quick?
Sure.
So in the init for both programmer and accountant, do we still need to have the name, employee ID, and department as arguments passed through since this already in the super?
Yes, you still need to have it pass through. Otherwise, the super would not be able to find it.
Okay.
Yes, and so anything else that you add into the init that does not exist in the parent will have to be initialized in its own line. But yeah, super does require these parameters to be passed into init. Employee inheritance is basically done by defining a child class with a parent class passed in as a parameter. And there are quite a few different models of inheritance, the most basic one being single inheritance, where you have a single parent and a single child. When we get to multiple inheritance, you could actually have a child inherit properties from multiple parents. And this can be useful. Let's say if you have your employee, but you also want to track something parallel to employment stats, for example. Like, let's say he was signing up for a 5K and you were trying to keep track of all the registrants. There could be a registrant class which he would inherit properties from. Next type of inheritance would be multi-level inheritance. And basically, this is when you have multiple tiers of inheritance, a parent, a child, and a grandchild, for example. And you could combine all of these things to have hierarchical inheritance, which is really just utilizing all of these previous forms of inheritance to create a more complex and dynamic system. And today we'll really only be covering single inheritance, and you'll be covering these more advanced models of inheritance later on this week with Chad. But for today, we want to make sure you have the basics down. So like mentioned earlier, we will be using super to avoid having to reinitialize params, and passing in params when instantiating a class basically is how you define the parameters for that instance of the class. So for this example, we have an employee Urkel, who is going to be a programmer. We pass in his name, his ID, and the languages that he'll be working with. So let me switch over to another screen. Today, you'll be continuing the exercises that you've been, at least one of the exercises that you've been working on for the past few days, and that is the user application. So real quick, how has that been going for you all? Have you found that challenge pretty easy? Is it in a good place to expand upon today?
I know when we were working on it last night, like I don't know, like a lot of us came up with like different ways to solve it. I guess like the README leaves like a lot of like space for like the requirements, I guess. So like for example, like I think it asked us to have a class variable that tracks all the posts, but then like at least our group like started to wonder, like would we also want, each user or to be able to get all of the posts for just a specific user? And some of us messed with that and some of us didn't. But yeah, I think I like peeked at today's stuff and haven't really worked on it, but I know it's like we're going to use like inheritance. So I don't know, hopefully the lecture will get us covered on that.
Right on. I guess you came in kind of late, Philip. We just had a really quick rundown of inheritance already. Let's see, I guess we could very quickly skim through it again. It is a very short slide deck, but let me go ahead and share it. So we just basically really went over the fundamentals, how when you are inheriting from a parent class, you are taking the parameters that are already existing for it. And you could use something called super to avoid having to reinitialize the parameters that have already been initialized. And any new parameter that does not belong to the parent class will have to be initialized in its own line. We also quickly covered different types of inheritance, which isn't so crucial for today's lesson because this, again, will be covered in more detail this Saturday. So for today, you'll really only be focused on single inheritance and learning how to use super to initialize parameters and utilizing these parameters to make whatever functions you need to work. And let's switch back to today's challenge. You are basically going to be expanding upon your app users, and you will be, I suppose you'll be converting what you already have into a base class that can be inherited from. And so it should be a pretty straightforward challenge. And the more features that you all started playing around with last night, the more you'll get to experiment or play around with how to refactor those parameters in an instantiated class. And then later on today, we will also be doing another challenge called guessing game. So in this challenge, you'll be utilizing inheritance to create a class called guessing game, which will validate whether a randomized number matches the value that is trying to be guessed. And it should be a fairly simple, straightforward challenge. So I thought about giving you all a stretch goal in addition to this. And that stretch goal is you will create a class called Hangman that utilizes the guessing game class to guess letters inside a word string. Let me just share this as well. I am going to run through how this might work. Let me know if this is too small. you all see this all right? Cool.
Yeah, it looks good.
So we've got a game called Hangman. It is asking me to guess a letter. If I guess the letter incorrectly, it tells me that I've guessed it incorrectly. If I try to guess that letter again, it tells me I've already guessed it. If I try to guess too many letters, it will tell me that I can't guess more than one letter at a time. And if I guess the correct letter, which, because it picks a random word, I'm not actually sure which word it wants me to guess. There you go. E is correct. It tells me it's correct and it goes to the next letter, which is probably going to be L, which is probably going to be E, which at this point can be maybe P or M, or you get the gist. So that is the stretch goal. Basically, you will have the next 15, 20, 25 minutes or so to work on app users 3. We'll check back in between around 6:30, 6:45. I'll check in at 6:30 first to see how everyone's doing, because it's fairly easy. I predict you all will be done fairly soon, at which point we'll take another break and jump into guessing game. And the stretch goal should take you through the rest of the evening, and then we'll reconvene at 8:45 for a final review. How does that all sound?
Sounds good.
Right on. Cool. If you were already working in groups for app users, go ahead and return to those groups. Were you working in groups, by the way? Were you working in pairs or larger groups?
It kind of opened up the breakout rooms, and then like some of us grouped up and some of us I think probably worked alone. But yeah, I feel like we probably remember who we were working with.
Okay, sure. I'll create, let's say 5 breakout rooms then. If you all need more, just let me know. And as usual, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Tiffany is not here at the moment. She'll be coming in a little late, but she should be here by around 6:30. Right on. So let's go ahead, let's break and get started on the first challenge, app users, at 6 o'clock.